The Lee Metford, or simply the magazine rifle, as it was first known, occupied a revolutionary, yet transitional position in British and Empire military firearms history. On one hand, it combined a number of features that separated it from the weapons that came before. It was the first rifle in military service in the British Empire that was designed for smokeless ammunition, notwithstanding the use of a black powder version of the .303 cartridge, used as a stopgap while a suitable smokeless propellant could be chosen. Cordite was selected as the propellant of choice, and it was this round that was used for the majority of the rifle's service life. Secondly, it was of a small bore, nominally .30 caliber. This gave a much higher velocity, flatter trajectory, and allowed the soldier to carry more ammunition. And thirdly, it had a magazine for repeated, rapid shooting. On the other hand, despite these advances, it was very much governed by the conventions and usages the Army had become accustomed to with the rifle that it replaced, namely the Martini-Henry. Therefore, single loading, afforded by a cutoff in the receiver, and the application of volley fire, with its extreme control of ammunition expenditure, figured prominently in the fire tactics prescribed at this time. So it was that the Army advanced cautiously into the era of the magazine rifle. There were three main conflicts fought using the Lee Metford and its later replacement, the magazine Lee Enfield. These were all fought at the end of the 1890s. They included the rebellion on the northwest frontier of India, also known as the Pathan Revolt, of 1897, the reconquest of the Sudan by Kitchener in 1898, and of course the Second Boer War in 1899. It would take action in all three of these campaigns for the Army's outlook on modern weaponry to fully mature. The Pathan Revolt revealed weaknesses in the extreme control and somewhat unthinking application of volley fire against fleeting, hiding tribesmen armed with sometimes very modern weapons. The campaign in the Sudan perhaps left a bit of a retrograde lesson in the use of modern military repeating rifles. Famously at the Battle of Omdurman in 1898, the Lee Metford, used in section volleys of 20 or so men at a time, at ranges that neared 2,000 yards, proved effective in stopping the massed dervish army of the Mahdi. None got closer than 800 yards. This crushing success was juxtaposed scarcely a year later, when the British Army suffered grievously in the opening moves of the Boer War. The so-called Black Week exposed weaknesses in tactics, both fire and maneuver, that would take hard lessons and many casualties to remedy. As they had on the northwest frontier, fire tactics suited to a poorly armed and massed enemy did not stand up to a fleeting hiding enemy using camouflage and entrenchments. In this video, we'll demonstrate the drills used to teach musketry with the Lee Metford, as well as demonstrate how these techniques were used collectively by troops on the battlefield. The reference for this video is the document entitled Rifle and Carbine Exercises, dating from 1898. I chose this version because of its efficiencies in words of command over the previous version of 1896. The two versions have actually very little difference between them when it comes to the firing exercise. Minor differences in words of command are about all that stands out. A good example of this difference in words of command is the executive command to fire volleys. In the 1896 version, the command volley firing was used. In the 1898 version, this was simplified to simply volleys. In the case of magazine fire, the 1896 version used the word of command with magazines ready. In 1898, this was simplified to simply magazine ready. It is of peculiar note that even in the version of 1898, mention is made in the text of the Mark I Lee Metford. Its single-stack magazine with 8-round capacity, as well as the special way you needed to charge the magazine, were both mentioned in the text. Musketry was broken down into two main categories. Individual fire, taught initially by numbers, included all the basic techniques used in subsequent applications. Collective fire, which by its definition included techniques used by groups of soldiers, was broken down into volley fire and independent fire. Typically, the first position taught would be the most basic, that of the standing position by numbers.
Individual by numbers, standing! Ready! 2. At 400. Present! Fire! Unload! Order! Arms!
On the word of command ready, the man adopted what was known as the ready position. He did this by throwing the weapon up and catching it under the right armpit, with the butt of the rifle above the right hand pouch. The left hand cradled the forestock just in front of the magazine. Simultaneous to this, the feet were repositioned by taking a pace to the left front with the left foot and bringing the right heel in, as was comfortable. On the word of command 2, what was known as the loading motion was executed. The right hand opened the bolt and withdrew a cartridge from the pouch, placing it in front of the bolt, which was then closed rapidly with the palm of the hand. The next step was the setting of the sights. When the range was given, the man drew the rifle back in the left hand and set his back sight. On the word of command present, the rifle was brought smartly to the shoulder, finger placed on the trigger, and the sights aligned. On the word of command fire, the trigger was squeezed, and the rifle was brought back to the ready position. When it was only intended that one round would be fired, the command unload was given. First, the cutoff was checked to see that it was properly closed. Then the bolt was worked rapidly back and forth, ejecting the spent casing. The trigger was then pressed, easing springs. The sights were then returned to the lowest setting. More a question of the formality of instruction. The man then was ordered back to the position of order arms. If the intent was to fire more than one round, then the word of command ready was used instead of unload.
Present! Fire! Ready! Present! Fire! Unload!
Next, the man could be taught individual fire from the kneeling position.
Individual by numbers, kneeling! Ready!
Here, the man brought the weapon up on top of the pouch, but under the arm, similar to the standing position. The feet were moved somewhat differently, and by taking a pace with the left foot to the right front, in front of the right toe, and dropping to the knee, the kneeling position was adopted.
Two.
On this command, the loading motion was performed in much the same way as the standing position, the only difference being that the left arm was supported on the left thigh.
At 400!
By drawing the rifle back in the left hand, the back sight was set to the appropriate range.
Present!
Here the rifle was brought up with the left elbow resting on the left knee.
Fire!
After firing, the rifle was brought back to the ready position.
Unload!
As with the standing position, the cutoff was checked, the bolt was cycled ejecting the case, springs were eased, and the sights reset.
Order! Arms!
The lying position was also an important part of the exercise.
Individual by numbers, lying! Ready!
Here, the man pivoted half right on his heels, brought the weapon up in the left hand, then bending down, reaching for the ground with the right, lowered himself into position.
Two.
Here, the loading motion was performed, similarly to the other positions.
At 400!
The right hand drew the rifle back in the left, and the sights were set.
Present!
The rifle was raised up on the elbows, and the sights were aligned.
Fire!
By simply extending the arms, the rifle was brought back to the ready position.
Unload!
Here, as with the other positions, the cutoff was checked, the bolt was cycled, the springs were eased, and the sights returned. Of course, musketry, as practiced in the preceding three positions, was scarcely more effective than that practiced with the Martini Henry. After all, these drills taught the man how to load and fire singly. The real power of these new rifles was in their capacity to hold rounds in a magazine for ready use. But before you could use the magazine, you had to know how to charge it.
With 5 cartridges! Charge magazines!
On this word of command, first the cutoff, then the bolt were opened sequentially. Then, and this is peculiar to the Mark I Lee Metford, the rounds were placed in the magazine rim first. This was due to the feed lips of the single-stack magazine being at the rear. Once the requisite number of rounds were placed in the magazine, the thumb was pushed down on the top round and the forefinger pushed in on the cutoff, closing it. The bolt was then closed and the trigger pressed, easing springs. In order to uncharge the magazine, the following drill was used.
Uncharge magazine!
By placing the thumb on top of the bolt and the index finger on the magazine release, squeezing it, the magazine was removed. It was then rotated on its link so that it lay flat against the bottom of the rifle, which was then rotated to the left. This presented the magazine in a handy position for uncharging. The rounds were then withdrawn from the magazine and returned to the pouch. Once the last round was withdrawn, the magazine was reseated in the body of the rifle. Having charged the magazine fire could then be achieved.
Individual by numbers, kneeling! Magazine ready!
On the word of command, first the man opened the cutoff by grabbing it with the thumb and the forefinger and pulling it smartly to the right. Immediately subsequent, he cycled the bolt, chambering around.
At 400!
The rest of the drill was similar to other positions using individual fire.
Present! Fire! Ready! Present! Fire! Ready! Present! Fire! Unload!
On the word of command, unload, first the cutoff was closed with the fingers of the right hand. Then the bolt was cycled, ejecting the spent casing, and springs were eased. The sights were then returned in the normal fashion. As a general concept, magazine fire was to be delivered in a rapid fashion. When applied to volley fire, the fire unit commander, usually the section commander, would issue his commands, ready and present, as fast as the men were able to cycle their bolts. When firing independently, the man was to fire at his best rate, while still maintaining accuracy. When the firing exercise was practiced in quick time, the executive to fire was the word commence. To order the men to stop firing, the command cease fire was used.
Independent lying! Magazine ready! At 400! Commence! Cease fire!
If, for whatever reason, the men had to return to single firing, the command
Close cutoff!
was used and single firing resumed. Of course, we can't talk about musketry with the Lee Metford without talking about the long-range sights, also known as the dial or volley sight. They consisted of two parts, the rear aperture and the front dial sight. These sights were used at extreme range on very large massed targets. First, the dial sight was adjusted so that the pointer indicated the appropriate range. As seen in this close-up, they were graduated from an almost incomprehensible 1,600 to 2,800 yards. Once the dial sight was properly set, the rear aperture could be raised into position. This diagram indicates the correct sight picture used. and the demonstration of the present using the sights set to 2200 yards shows you the extreme angle that the weapon has to be positioned at. This angle also shows with effect the position the rifle must be held at to line the sights up correctly. The whole intent of fire delivered this way was not to hit individuals or even small groups, but when confronted with a massed enemy, massed fire at general ranges was good enough. This role on the battlefield would later be taken up by the increased use of the machine gun. So musketry was practiced, first using individual fire, by numbers. Once this was mastered, the usual way of practicing the firing exercise was in quick time. The main difference between this and practicing the firing exercise by numbers was the omission or modification of some of the words of command. The two parts of the ready drill, namely the ready position and the loading motion, were combined under the single word of command ready. And as already mentioned, the executive word of command to fire was commence. Individual fire by numbers was a vehicle of training. Rarely would a man be operating by himself on the battlefield. Therefore, the principles learned in individual fire would then be applied to collective fire. As mentioned earlier, there were two types of collective fire, volley fire and independent fire. Here we'll have a demonstration of both types in the primary fighting formation, extended order.
Volleys! Ready!
As you can see, the men are extended at 4 pace intervals.
At 400! Present! Fire! Ready! Present! Fire! Three rounds independent. Magazine ready. Commence.
These same techniques could be applied when the troops were in close order.
Volleys!
On this caution, the rear rank took 1 pace forward and 1 pace to the right, covering off the intervals between the front rank.
Ready!
If not otherwise directed, fire delivered in close order was done so with the front rank kneeling.
At 400! Present! Fire! Ready! Present! Fire! Three rounds independent. Magazine ready! Commence!
In 1903, with the close of the Boer War, the lessons learnt in the hard campaign in South Africa were embodied in a whole new series of texts. The very ethos of musketry was being redirected. Gone were the pedantic volleys practiced in the 1890s, replaced by a universal reliance on independent fire. This new outlook on infantry fighting, born out of the hardship of the Boer War, was to pay dividends some 11 years later with the outbreak of the Great War. I might make mention of the order of dress worn in this video. For the reconquest of the Sudan in 1898, the British Brigade was formed of 4 different battalions: the 1st Royal Warwickshire Regiment, the 1st Lincolnshire Regiment, the 1st Queen's Own Cameron Highlanders, and the 1st Battalion, the Seaforth Highlanders. The campaign featured universally worn khaki frocks, and the British troops were armed with the Lee Metford. The Foreign Service helmets of the Seaforth Highlanders were adorned with a tartan patch, their cap badge, and a white hackle. The campaign featured the universal use in British battalions of the Slade Wallace or Pattern 1888 equipment. 2 major battles were fought during this campaign, the first being the Battle of Atbara, which featured an attack on the Dervish Zariba, and the second being the Battle of Omdurman, which featured British, Egyptian, and Sudanese battalions all fighting from behind their own Zariba. In both these battles, the Seaforth Highlanders, with their Lee Metfords, fought in kit that this video seeks to replicate. Kilt, hair sporran, and diced hose tops figured prominently in what was otherwise a predominantly khaki-clothed army.